I don't have a clear understanding of Philip's concept of God.
The God of limited power. This can elegantly account both for fine-tuning and for suffering.
These views are philosophically, scientifically, and historically untenable.
I have a feeling you don't agree with that account of the resurrection.
No.
There are a fair number of scholars who think the first Christians identified the resurrection essentially. This isn't just something I've made up.
You don't understand them.
There is no incoherence in what I just described.
This cosmic panpsychism is what appears to be a devastating objection.
Bill said something that was just false.
Do you think that God is an unembodied mind distinct from the universe?
I think it's probably fair to say that we've witnessed a fairly left hemispheric conversation.
Do you think I'm a Christian?
Me? You're asking me?
I'm just curious.
Hello, welcome to the show. Today, bringing you a conversation between William Lane Craig and Philip Goff on the universe, suffering, and Christian faith. Bill Craig is one of the most influential Christian philosophers in the world. Philip Goff is also a notable panpsychist philosopher, and I've engaged with them both on our first season of the Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God podcast. But as you'll hear, Philip has been on a journey lately towards what he calls a mildly heretical form of Christianity. But what will William Lane Craig make of it? Well, strap in for a spirited philosophical and theological conversation. And do like this video and subscribe to the channel for more great thinking faith conversations. By the way, after the dialogue, I'll be giving my reflections on the conversation alongside my friend and colleague, Peter Byrom. Just before we jump in, did you know that if you become a silver or gold level supporter of my work, you get early access to episodes, as well as my full-length interview with Philip Goff from Season 1 of The Surprising Rebirth? It's only available to supporters. Gold supporters also get free signed copies of both my books and a chance for a monthly catch-up. Enjoy. Welcome to today's show, a conversation between William Lane Craig and Philip Goff on the universe, suffering, and Christian faith. Philip Goff is Professor of Philosophy at Durham University and recently announced that he had changed his mind about God, saying he's become, in his own words, a slightly heretical Christian. Well, Philip is well known as a proponent of panpsychism, the view that consciousness is fundamental to reality, and as a critic of atheistic materialism, expressed in his books such as Galileo's Error and Why, the Purpose of the Universe. But now Philip says he's become convinced that God is real after finding a way to resolve his concerns over the problem of evil by believing in a God of limited power. But what sort of God does that leave us with, and how does it relate to the historic Christian claims about the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ? Well, joining Philip for this conversation is William Lane Craig, a well-known Christian philosopher and founder of the ministry Reasonable Faith. Bill is Emeritus Professor of Philosophy at Talbot School of Theology and ranks as one of the most influential Christian thinkers of the 21st century, having debated many leading atheists around the world. I've been had the honour of hosting some of those conversations and authoring hundreds of articles, papers and books. Most recently, his magnum opus, Systematic Philosophical Theology, Volume 1. Well, today, Bill and Philip will discuss Philip's apparent embrace of this limited form of theism and how these issues of cosmology, suffering and the resurrection of Christ play into this conversation on God, philosophy and theology. So, gentlemen, welcome along to the show.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Justin. Looking forward to it.
Well, I'm looking forward to it because it's been a little while since I've been in this sort of moderator position. And what a wonderful thing to return to such a meaty discussion and with two such eminent guests. So thank you both again for joining me. Before we hear from you, Bill, I'll start with Philip. And Philip, you've been on a very interesting journey in the last few years. I wonder if you could firstly recap something of your own relationship with church and Christianity, a little bit about your commitment to panpsychism and what's happened most recently now that you describe yourself as a so-called heretical Christian.
Yeah, thanks a lot. It has indeed been quite a journey. Well, I was raised Catholic in a vibrant church community in Liverpool. But by the time I was 14, I decided God didn't exist, so I refused to get confirmed. It's upset my grandmother a little bit. My mum sent me to see the local priest who tried Pascal's wager on me, but fortunately didn't work. So I spent the next 3 decades an atheist. And I've recently returned to Christianity of some form. But I guess, as you say, my route there and perhaps my final destination is maybe a little bit non-standard. So maybe I could briefly fill in some of the details.
Please do. Yeah, tell us what happened.
Well, I think this actually began when I started teaching philosophy of religion, when I came to Durham University, where I teach now, about 7 years ago. And, I was asked to teach a standard philosophy of religion course. You teach the arguments against God, you teach the arguments for God. Then the students have to make their mind up which is more compelling and write their essay. So I taught the arguments against God, thought, yep, very compelling, definitely no God. But then I taught the arguments for God, and to my surprise, I found some of these, in particular the argument from fine-tuning, quite compelling as well. So this left me in a bit of a predicament. I seemed to be being pulled in 2 opposite directions by equally compelling arguments. And, I wrestled with this for some time. To be honest, it gave me some sleepless nights. I don't like it when I can't work out what I think about a certain philosophical matter. But at some point there was a eureka moment when I realized, actually, these aren't necessarily pointing in opposite directions. The arguments against God are arguing against a very specific form of God, what philosophers call the omni-God, all-knowing, all-powerful, and perfectly good. Whereas the arguments for God, or at least the ones I was taking seriously, argued for something much more generic, something God-ish. So if you go for something God-ish, but not the omni-God, you can have your cake and eat it. And this led to my most recent book called Why the Purpose of the Universe, where I explored the middle ground between traditional atheism and traditional theism. And one view I took very seriously here is the hypothesis of a God of limited power, a perfectly good God who's just not all-powerful. And I'm convinced this can elegantly account both for fine-tuning in terms of God's purposes and for suffering in terms of God's limitations. And I really think it's where the evidence is pointing. But none of this was talking much about Christianity at this stage. I think just briefly there were 2 further pieces in the jigsaw, 2 further stages to take me to Christianity. So the first one was becoming acquainted with the mystical traditions of Christianity, which have always been there right back to the early days, but are perhaps more prominent in the Eastern Orthodox Church. For example, their view of salvation, it's not about God finding someone to punish for our sins. It's about God bringing God and humanity into unity, into a deep state of oneness. God, through Jesus, shares in our form of existence so that we can share more deeply in God's form of existence. Now, this was a way of thinking about Christianity that deeply resonated with me. I heard nothing about it in my Catholic upbringing, but it's one that now deeply resonates with me. But I still had problems with the resurrection. And the final piece in the puzzle here was reading Dale Allison's fairly recent book on the resurrection, which explores some slightly non-standard views of the resurrection, including, amongst other things, the idea that the resurrection experiences of the first Christians were visionary rather than a matter of seeing and touching a body. So this was the final piece. And so just to bring everything together, I guess there's 3 ideas that led me back to this slightly heretical form of Christianity. The idea of a God of limited power, the mystical traditions of Christianity, and this slightly non-standard version of the resurrection. And just very, very finally, I find each of these have plausibility in their own right, but I find also they cohere together and yield a unified worldview that makes a lot of intellectual sense to me, but which I've also found makes sense of some of my deepest spiritual experiences.
Well, thank you very much for that overview of the journey you've been on, and we'll come back to the panpsychism part of this as well in a moment. I imagine Bill will want to get a bit of a sense of where you are on that as well. I saw you reaching for a book, Bill, as Philip was talking. Was it Dale Allison's book on the resurrection or another one?
I've got that one on the shelf, but the one I reached for was N.T. Wright's The Resurrection of the Son of God, which I think poses pretty severe problems for Philip's interpretation of the resurrection as being identical with the ascension of Jesus.
Okay. Well, we'll come to
talk about that later.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, what overall? Yeah, you've heard obviously there a little bit of Philip's journey. What's your overall response to his embrace of this particular form of theism, and what are some of the questions I suppose you'll be wanting to dig into as we go forward?
I don't have a clear understanding of Philip's concept of God. And so my problem with his views is not that they're unorthodox, even though, of course, they are, but rather that they strike me as wild speculations that are philosophically, scientifically, and historically untenable. And I've identified 5 specific areas of disagreement with Philip's views as I understand them. Number 1 would be his philosophy of mind. Number 2 would be his proffered explanation of the fine-tuning of the universe for embodied conscious agents. Number 3 is his solution to the problem of suffering and evil. Number 4 will be his reinterpretation of Christianity. And finally, number 5, his claim that his view is consistent with New Testament evidence. In each of those 5 areas, I have multiple disagreements with his views as I understand them.
Well, hopefully we'll clarify that understanding, but that'll give us plenty to talk about in the rest of the show, that's for sure. I mean, starting with number 1, I wonder, that obviously brings us somewhat to the panpsychism issue. So why don't we start there, Philip? Just explain your philosophy of mind and what, for you, this panpsychist view is. Obviously, try to do it as briefly as possible, and we'll see what Bill has to say in response.
Well, just firstly, I'm not sure there is that much of a connection between the panpsychism I'm most known for in my philosophical career and the Christianity I've embraced. I suppose I'm attracted to certain views of God closer to panentheism we might get into that are fit well with panpsychism. But for me, actually, we could talk about that. I'm happy to talk about that. But to me, that's not a deal breaker. That's not the core thing for me, which made sense to me, which is a deal breaker, is God being limited in power. That's what makes it make intellectual sense to me. So that, but on the panpsychism, I suppose, very briefly, I'm always keen to emphasize with consciousness, it's not just a scientific problem, because consciousness is not publicly observable. You can't look in someone's head and see their feelings and experiences. So we're limited in how we can deal with it experimentally. I think essentially all we can do experimentally is work out which kinds of brain states correlate with which kinds of experience. We can do that because we can ask people while we're scanning their brains. But that leaves open the why question. Why? Why does brain activity go along with consciousness at all? And here we have to turn to the various philosophical possibilities. Roughly, physicalism, that the physical universe is fundamental and consciousness arises from brain processes. Panpsychism does it upside down. Consciousness is fundamental and actually physical reality emerges from some more fundamental story about consciousness. Or the view I think Bill might be attracted to, dualism, both consciousness and the physical world are distinct but intimately connected. And I think we can't work these out. The experimental data is just neutral on all these. But panpsychism, I think, in terms of simplicity, in terms of its explanatory potential, does a lot better than the rivals. That's it, really.
Well, I'll allow you to respond to that, Bill. What's your understanding of panpsychism? Does it tally with Philip's, and why do you think it is relevant to the God question in the end?
My concern is with his panentheism, that God is not something distinct from the world.
Okay.
He's defended a version of panpsychism according to which the universe is a personal agent who can contemplate the future and make rational decisions about what that's his word, what she wants to do. Now, it's really important for your listeners that we understand that his view is not that the universe and every material particle in it has a soul. That would be mind-body dualism. Rather, Philip accepts a non-reductive physicalism, according to which all that exists is physical, and mental states are properties of physical objects. By contrast, the existence of God, as classically conceived, requires substance dualism, which Philip rejects. And I think that this philosophy of mind of non-reductive physicalism is attended by all of the problems that are inherent in such a physicalism. First of all, it seems to me to be involved in a fundamental category mistake. The physical objects, like the brain, have physical properties like weight, mass, density, spatial location, and so forth. But it's just a category mistake to say that the brain has mental properties. The brain is not happy. The brain is not sad. The brain is not fretting or jubilant. These are properties of a self or soul and not of a physical object. Worse, I think his view is very unscientific. Biologists have expended enormous energy trying to figure out how deep consciousness extends into the animal kingdom. And the evidence shows that an incomprehensibly complex neural structure is necessary as the substrate for states of consciousness. So higher animals, like vertebrates, have conscious states and complex neural systems, but most living organisms do not. Ants, slugs, oysters, algae, bacteria, mushrooms, these don't have mental states, according to the evidence. And to go further than that and suggest that inanimate objects, like the chair you're sitting on or my pen, have mental states of consciousness just seems to me to be preposterous. And to suggest that the universe as a whole, especially the structureless, featureless universe prior to the Planck time, is a personal agent, just flies in the face of the scientific evidence. Two more points. Non-reductive physicalism is incompatible with mental causation and freedom of the will. This is a commitment to the causal closure of the physical. Every physical event is explicable solely in terms of prior physical events. And therefore, your mental states are causally a feat, and free agency is ruled out. And that implies that the universe is not a free agent after all. And if that personal universe is God, as panentheism suggests, then it means that God is not a free moral agent. And finally, I think that this cosmic panpsychism, as a philosophy of mind, faces what appears to be a devastating objection. Philip has written, and I quote, "The universe is a conscious subject. All other things, from planets to human beings to fundamental particles, are conscious subjects that exist as proper parts of the universe subject." But it is almost axiomatic in the philosophy of mind that one person cannot be a part of another person. When two persons get together, they are never a third person. Now, since we are persons, the universe cannot therefore be a person of which we are parts, as Philip imagines. And as I say, if we identify this agentive universe with the panentheistic God, then that spells the end of God's being a person.
Well, gosh, there's so much to unpack there just from the very outset, Philip. I'm not sure where you want to begin. Perhaps where I would like to begin, though, is the fact that Bill obviously equates panpsychism with, as he calls it, non-reductive physicalism. Do you recognize that as a description of your sort of position?
Thanks, Bill. There's loads in that. Very interesting. Well, no, but I mean, I guess this may depend, I don't want to get too lost in terminology. Some people use the word physical in different ways. I do think Bill's using a very highly non-standard use of that term, but I don't want to get lost in terminology. I just want to say briefly, I will come to the criticisms of panpsychism, but just to emphasize again, I don't think my conception of Christianity is intimately or essentially connected to the panpsychism. In the Why book, I did defend, among other views, the view Bill describes there, but I don't, in the context of Christianity, I don't think that's necessarily the view I would go for. I'm attracted to looser forms of panentheism, which have more to God than simply the universe. It's not, God isn't just the conscious universe. I'm also attracted actually more to views in which there is overlap, but there is more to us than God. There is more to God than the universe. Think of a Venn diagram. There's, God on one side, the universe on the other, and then there's something in common, some aspect of our nature that's overlaps with some aspect of God's nature. But anyway, we could come back to that. But coming to the criticisms of panpsychism, this idea that it's just it's a logical incoherence to say the brain has consciousness. I mean, I'm not sure how much Bill's got the details of the contemporary Bertrand Russell inspired version of panpsychism, which draws on very important work from the 1920s by Russell. I think Russell is a sort of Darwin of consciousness, and his core insight was that physical science doesn't really tell us what matter is. It just gives us this kind of abstract mathematical structure. As Hawking famously said, physics doesn't tell us what breathes fire into the equations and makes a universe for them to describe. So physics really actually doesn't care what is at the fundamental level of reality. All physics cares about is that it has the right mathematical structure. As long as you've got that, you'll get physics out of that. So the panpsychist exploits this and postulates forms of very simple conscious entities through their interactions, making the right mathematical structure. So I think given how little physics really tells us about what matter in the brain is, this idea that we can rule out that there is consciousness in there, I think just makes no sense. The point that it's unscientific, I find it a little bit ironic seeing as Bill is sympathetic to Michael Murray, who's inclined to the idea that dogs don't feel pain. I mean, I've been talking to scientists and philosophers about consciousness for 20 years now. I haven't met a single one who thinks mammals don't feel pain. I don't know, maybe we could come back to that. But look, as I said, consciousness is not publicly observable, right? What we can do scientifically, we can track the human case, and even now there's just no consensus, although we've made some progress. And then we can try and extrapolate to the animal case, but the more it gets away from animals, the harder that gets. And until we've got consensus on what the neural correlates of consciousness are, we can't settle that. I mean, actually, the movement does seem to be, contrary to Michael Murray, more and more things having consciousness. It's a recent letter from dozens of scientists taking seriously the idea of insect consciousness now. There was something about... Bill said something that was just false. That it is axiomatic that you can't have conscious part wholes. That is false. There is a big debate with two sides on this. I don't know, everyone's hanging around with substance dualists who I know substance dualists who are open to that still. I've got a co-written paper with Luke Roloffs, can subject some. It's a hotly open debate. But actually, on that point and the libertarian free will point, I don't think me and Bill need to clash on this, actually, because I'm open to strong emergent forms of panpsychism, not necessarily reductive forms, where there are new forms of consciousness, new conscious unities, new minds that emerge at the human level that have their own causal powers, that have libertarian free will. I spend a lot of time making sense of libertarian free will in my Why book in a panpsychist context. And so you needn't even have part wholes. So I don't think there is a real clash there. I think I covered everything.
With the time we've got, I don't want to spend the whole discussion, though we could do, debating the ins and outs of panpsychism. I'll just allow Bill a brief comeback on some of those points you raised, and then let's talk about these other aspects.
Very briefly, it seems to me that Philip just mires himself deeper into these problems that I suggested. In particular, I got to say, you've misrepresented Michael Murray's view. Of course, Murray recognizes that higher animals, sentient animals, have conscious states of pain. What he suggests has not been proven is that they have a third level of consciousness, of being aware that one is oneself in pain. That requires self-consciousness. And apart from perhaps the higher primates, that is not exhibited by animals. They have states of pain, but they do not have that third level awareness of being oneself in pain. Now, if you go the emergentist route, Philip, it sounds to me there like you're bordering on dualism. That would be a position like William Hasker has defended, where in the course of the evolution of these neurologically complex systems, a mental substance emerges. And so you do have mind-body dualism, and that would give you some room for having a dualistic conception where God is an unembodied mind. And that's not clear to me yet that you believe that. You still seem to be in process. Do you think that God is an unembodied mind distinct from the universe?
Just briefly on Michael Murray, I mean, he draws on higher order thought theory, which holds that without those higher forms of reflective thought, you do not have the conscious experience. He compares it to blind sight, where people have certain cognitive information without the conscious experience. I mean, I think Ned Block has done an incredible job of debunking the higher order thought stuff as a theory of consciousness. But Michael Murray does build on that. But I think you're right. The important point is, what are we thinking about God here? I'm in agreement. Once we're thinking about Christianity, even the panentheistic view that everything is in God is also problematic, because that means maybe, like, my bad choices are God's bad choices. So this is why I'm now attracted to this view that, as I say, it's not a deal breaker for me, but that that there is a purely immaterial aspect to God. There is a pure, a non-divine aspect to us, but there is overlap. There is something in our nature which overlaps with an aspect of God's nature. We find this in the Christian mystic Meister Eckhart, for example. Why do I like this view? Because I think it makes sense of mystical experiences, which have been found in all cultures, including Christianity. Many people with these experiences have this deep sense that God pervades the universe, that God isn't distant out there. God is right here now in our hearts, in our midst. I think this overlap view makes good sense of this.
Pipe up. I mean, even perhaps possibly, Paul's words quoting the Athenian philosophers in Acts, in him we live and move and have our being, I've heard it used as a sort of justification for that more mystical union with God that edges towards something a bit more like panentheism. Bill, obviously for you, that you have these concerns about, the kind of God Philip is talking about here, though it sounds as though Philip is actually saying, well, he's sort of on a journey here. He's sort of open to other explanations, possibly even somewhat sympathetic to the idea of a immaterial mind that is separate from the universe. And that does help. I think it might help to us to come to a point of actual agreement possibly between you both, having spelled out some of these differences, which is that obviously Philip has explained that part of the reason for him taking the God hypothesis seriously has been this fine-tuning argument, which you have obviously outlined many times in your own debates and books. And to that extent, it sounds as though there's some shared common ground there. I won't go into the detail of the fine-tuning argument itself. People can go and look it up. But essentially, it's this idea that, yes, the universe has the properties and quantities and numbers that seem perfectly dialed for human existence. That has persuaded Philip. What's your concern then, Bill, about, given that positive evidence for God, what are your concerns about the kind of God that we're then talking about in consequence?
That's exactly the point, Justin. Philip proposes to limit the power of the universe to choosing just the values of the cosmic parameters, but not the laws of nature. And if he does hold to such a restriction, that seems to me to be utterly ad hoc and implausible. If God is powerful enough to pick the values of the constants and quantities, surely a transcendent God could decree the laws of nature as well, unless you hold to this panentheistic, physicalistic view that God just is the universe. Moreover, I think there's a kind of vicious circularity in Philip's hypothesis. In order for the cosmos to be a rational agent capable of choosing the values of the constants and quantities that are necessary for intelligent life, the universe must already possess those values that makes intelligent life possible. There's a vicious circularity here. The universe can't choose these values because those values have to be in place in order for the universe to be a conscious living thing. Now, Philip tries to avoid this problem by hypothesizing that prior to the Planck time, the universe had not yet chosen the finely tuned values of the constants and quantities, and that, it seems to me, is manifestly self-defeating because intelligent life already did exist prior to the Planck time, on his view, namely the agent universe itself. And then finally, I think his hypothesis leaves the existence of the universe itself unexplained. What is the explanation of the existence of the universe? To allay this shortcoming, Philip has the additional hypotheses that the physical universe exists necessarily, but it's only contingently a physical object. And secondly, that the non-physical phase of the universe caused its physical phase. And it seems to me that this is the undoing of his physicalistic panentheism, because on this view, it turns out that the cause of the universe is a necessarily existing, non-physical, transcendent, personal agent, after all, which is the classical concept of God. So the only novelty here would be that on Philip's view, God turns himself into a material thing, which I think is intuitively metaphysically impossible.
Okay, Philip.
Thanks. You've done your homework, and yeah, a lot of interesting points there. Where to begin? I mean, so again, to repeat, insofar as I'm now taking Christianity seriously, I'm not thinking about God being the conscious universe or something that becomes the conscious universe. I mean, just on that, I would still defend that view. I wasn't clear why it's a problem that before the Planck constant, the universe exists. I mean, the point is the universe fixes the constants for there to be more forms of life. That's I wasn't sure the point there. And this idea, it's unintuitive that the God could become the universe. I mean, I think this is the kind of thing Russell helps with, because we don't know what the hell matter is. We just have this mathematical structure, so it could be a kind of conscious mind. But look, I mean, maybe the most helpful thing is just, I am persuadable. I don't necessarily agree. I like some form of kind of panentheismal view in which God and the universe are not entirely distinct, because I think that fits better with mystical experiences. I'm not yet persuaded that doesn't make sense, but I am persuadable. It's not the big thing for me. So maybe it would be good to let's pretend my God is just like the traditional God, just like the God Bill believes in, except has limited power. And that would get us back to the first criticism. Am I all right to address that?
No, that's fine. Hi, it's Justin here. Hope you're enjoying the conversation. Just to say, if you'd like a free chapter from my book, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, I'll send it to you when you join my newsletter. The link is with the info below. And now, back to where we left off. Because I was going to say, it's been fascinating to kind of hear this back and forth between two such, learned philosophers on the issues that Bill obviously sees with Panpsychism Panentheism. But I think that's probably a helpful thing to do. Let's park that whole question at this point and just grant, for the sake of argument now, that we're talking about a God that you broadly agree on, in a sense, an immaterial mind that is responsible for the physical universe, and then the question arises, of course, well, how do we make sense of that? Because this is kind of really where the core of your latest thinking has gone, Philip. It's this question: well, if I'm drawn to believing in God at that level, but I struggle with the problem of evil and suffering. And so you've come up with this solution to that. Perhaps you could just briefly spell that out in a little detail, and then we'll have Bill respond to that.
Yeah, so I mean, maybe I could be a bit more specific about what exactly God's powers are. And there's a bigger story here, but the basic idea, to cut it short, is that, if you take physics, take the values of the constants out, that will give you a certain mathematical structure. And then the claim is God is constrained to create a universe from a singularity with that mathematical structure, but has freedom to select the values of the constants, but then can't then fiddle thereafter. And the thought then is this gives us a nice explanation of the problem of why there's evil and suffering, right? The only way God could create intelligent life is by creating a universe with the right numbers in physics that will eventually evolve intelligent life. And God knew it was going to be messy, and God's like, I'm sorry, I know it was this or nothing. Now, just Bill raised the problem of if God is powerful enough, I get this a lot, if God is powerful enough to create a universe, how come God can't do more? I think this is the mistake here, is thinking all power is on a kind of spectrum. What level are you on? But I mean, there's different kinds of power. I mean, who's more powerful, Vladimir Putin or the strongest man in the world? They're powerful in different ways. There is no incoherence in what I just described. A being that can create a universe from a singularity with certain constraints, but can't fiddle thereafter. That is perfectly coherent. And why I take this seriously is because, I think Christians have to give some explanation of why there are bad things in the world. I find none of the explanations Christians offer very satisfactory, and this gives us a wonderfully simple explanation.
Bill, your response.
The concept of God as a maximally great being entails that God will be omnipotent, because power is a great-making property. And therefore, a limited deity may be a God with a small g, but it is not God in the sense of a capital G, a maximally great or perfect being. But even waiving that, Philip's attempt to limit God's power so that he cannot prevent much of the seemingly gratuitous evil in the world, I think, is very implausible, because you don't need to be omnipotent in order to prevent disasters like the Lisbon earthquake or the recent South Asian tsunami. On Christian theism, God is the creator of the universe and able to act causally within it. And if, as Philip believes, God can dematerialize Jesus' body from the tomb and assume him into heaven, God could certainly dematerialize Adolf Hitler when he's about to attack Poland at the beginning of World War II. So the problem with this limited theism by Philip, I think, is it's just not plausible. You don't need to be enormously powerful to be able to prevent many of the seemingly gratuitous evils in the world.
And Philip, we'll get your response to that. But just before we do, Bill, could you very briefly sketch how you approach this problem of suffering? Because there may be people watching and listening who simply haven't particularly encountered any particularly, plausible explanation for why God would allow such things.
Yes. I take a Molinist perspective on the problem of evil and suffering. That is to say, God has knowledge of what any free agent that he might create would freely do in any circumstances in which he might place them. And God knows that many free agents would act in evil and sinful ways in the circumstances in which he creates them. But he allows them to do that with a view toward actualizing his previsioned ends for human history. And we, in our limited frameworks of time and space, are simply not in a position to say that a God endowed with middle knowledge probably doesn't have a morally sufficient reason for permitting this or that evil to occur. Every event that occurs sends a ripple effect through history, such that God's morally sufficient reason for permitting it might not occur until centuries later, perhaps in another country. And so when you look at it in that way, I think you can see that it is just way beyond our ability to say of any particular example of evil or suffering that God probably doesn't have a good reason for allowing it to occur. In addition to that, I think that evil actually proves the existence of God. And it would go like, my argument would go like this. If God does not exist, then objective moral values do not exist. Without God as the standard, then everything becomes relative and subjective. Premise 2, evil exists. This is what we all recognize. 3, therefore, objective moral values exist. 4, therefore, God exists. So even though on a superficial level, evil might seem to call into question God's existence, I think on a deeper level, evil actually proves God's existence, because in the absence of God, moral evil as such would not exist.
Well, thank you very much. That's helpful to kind of get your take on how you respond to the problem of evil. But coming back, Philip, to Bill's original concerns with the way that you've solved the problem yourself, he says, well, surely a limited God could actually do a certain amount, and so simply having the limited power, a power version of God, doesn't really solve the problem that you think it does.
Good. I mean, if we were just dealing with fine-tuning, I don't think Bill has any kind of objection here. I mean, I specified what God's abilities were, is unable to intervene afterwards. Given that specification, which is perfectly coherent and is very simple. That's the point. It's simpler than physics, right? If it's simpler than physics, I don't think you can. I think what we want is a simple hypothesis that accounts for the data. This is a very simple hypothesis that can account for both suffering and fine-tuning. It's part of the hypothesis that God can't intervene. I accept things get trickier if we want to make sense of Christianity. I've got a big detailed paper going into this that I sent Bill before this, which, and this is why I'm less confident. I will admit I'm less confident about the truth of Christianity. I'm confident enough to have faith in it, but I'm less confident than I am about a God of limited powers. I think the hypothesis there is wonderfully simple and elegant. Basically, what I say about what Bill referred to is that I try to make sense of God having the power to incarnate in the traditional philosophical sense, to unify an aspect of God's being with an aspect of the physical universe, such as a newly formed embryo, and then at a later date to, as it were, reabsorb that now physical entity. Sounds a bit weird, but I think all of these things are weird, so in some sense. But I think this is a fairly simple addition to God's powers, which doesn't entail that God can dematerialize Hitler, because Hitler obviously wasn't God incarnate. God can only reabsorb aspects of himself that have become physical. So I think that deals with our objection. Let me just I've got lots of deep problems with Molinism, which is so foundational to Bill's alternative. We should see this as comparing two solutions to the problem of evil, I think. I've always found Molinism such a peculiar view. And just let's take a concrete example to try and make this vivid. Suppose I've got some moral dilemma. Suppose I'm, really want to kill a philosophical rival because I'm jealous. He always, publishes more than me. I always used to give examples of cheating on my wife, and then I'm worrying, getting tempted to cheat, and I'm worried she's going to get suspicious. So here's a new example.
Not a good example.
So I'm sitting there, am I going to give in to this jealousy and kill this person, or am I my conscience going to get the better of me? Now, for Molinists, on the one hand, they believe in strong libertarian free will. It's up to me. It's totally up to me. Nothing constrains me, whether I'm going to kill or whether I'm not. On the other hand, they think that prior to my choice, in fact, for billions of years, there is a fact of the matter about what I would do in these circumstances. It's set in stone, completely independent of my choice, what I would do. And these seem to me, at the very least, deeply in tension. If there's a fact of the matter independent of my choice about what I would do, it seems to me I'm not really free. The matter's settled, independent of my choice. So that's one difficulty.
I suspect this will take us off into another debate on Molinism, but I'll give you a brief opportunity to respond, Bill, and then I'd love, and then we'll move on to the resurrection as well. But
I'll ask you a question, Philip. Don't you believe that future contingent propositions are sometimes true?
Good question. I think there's an important difference here. I said, I slipped in there that there's a fact of the matter independent of my choice. So independent in the sense that what I would do if let's say I would kill. Let's have the fun option. Sort of. That would be explained. That's not, for the Molinist, explained by my choice. Whereas suppose to take the contrast case that you're pointing to there, I think, Bill. So suppose we think the future exists, and then as I'm sitting here wondering whether I'm going to kill this person, the future is there, and there's me in the future making the choice, killing the person. So there is a fact of the matter then, but it's a fact of the matter that it's explained, that's grounded in my future choice. So that's consistent with my free will. But for the Molinist, the fact that what I would do is not grounded in, it's not explained by my choice. If anything, it's prior to my choice. It goes back, it informed God's creation plan that put me in the situation where I've got this choice in the first place. So that's the problem, the independence from my choice that I think is the problem that, for me, constrains free will.
This is the so-called grounding objection, which
I don't think it is. I don't think it is the grounding objection. I didn't say anything about what grounds these truths. I said that they constrain our freedom. It's a different objection.
Oh, well, they clearly don't constrain our freedom, because we have the ability to actualize the consequence of those counterfactuals of creaturely freedom about what we would do. There's no causal constraint. So I think it's clearly compatible with the strong view of libertarian freedom.
Well, I think there is a fact of the matter set in stone, explanatorily prior to my choice about what I would do in those circumstances. That does constrain my freedom. I've been researching it. Bill had an answer to this 30 years ago, objecting to this notion of explanatory priority that is sometimes charged against Molinists. But actually, and I think that was a good response in the 90s, but since then there's been a lot of work on the nature of explanatory priority, on the nature of priority, and there is a broadly accepted understanding of explanatory priority there in a lot of different areas involving what we call directed acyclical graphs, that is cross-categorial, is asymmetric, is transitive, and avoids these response Bill made in the 90s. So I really think there's a deep concern here that not just me, a lot of people have this deep concern that the kind of conditionals Molists believe in constrain our freedom. And yeah, I think I'd like to see Bill reply to those recent moments in the literature.
We won't have time for a fulsome reply now, but Bill, just briefly your thoughts on that, and we'll move into talking about the issue of the resurrection as well.
I just fundamentally disagree. I don't think any good argument to think that the truth of counterfactuals of creaturely freedom, like if I were rich, I would buy a Mercedes, constrains my freedom any more than saying that a future contingent proposition like I will buy a Mercedes constrains my freedom because it's true prior to my making that choice.
But Bill, have you come across paper, for example, in Mind by Rubio and Klemenhager, responding to your point from the 90s with this new, now commonly accepted understanding of explanatory priority?
I haven't seen the Rubio paper.
I'd love to see what response you have to that. That's what I found very compelling.
That may be a conversation for another day.
Yes,
and I'm aware we're obviously going down some really interesting philosophical rabbit trails. But let's bring it back to this question of the limited God. Bill obviously doesn't feel that this adequately accounts for suffering, and doesn't sort of let you off the hook, as it were. I'm going to leave that one there just because, for the sake of time, I do want to get to another interesting aspect of this so-called heretical Christianity that you've embraced, Philip, which is that you know, one of the most significant things I think about your story is that you are, as it were, doing your best to kind of take Christianity very seriously, its historic claims. As you say, having gone from atheism, perhaps through some period of agnosticism, you're now saying, actually, I really do believe Jesus is the Son of God. Now, of course, that all rather depends on what exactly you mean by those terms, but certainly you've said that you believe that Jesus, from what you've already said on the show, has some kind of unique sharing in God's divine nature, and that ultimately something did happen in that tomb when Jesus' body was resurrected. Now, as far as I understand it, you're not claiming, however, that it was a physical bodily resurrection. So do you want to maybe just sketch out your view on the resurrection, which, as Bill has already intimated, also seems to relate to the story of the Ascension as well?
Yeah, so I guess I have a problem with the traditional view of the resurrection because, as we've discussed, my explanation of why there is suffering, I wish there were no suffering, why there is suffering is God can't prevent it. But if God can raise people from the dead, well, okay, we get back to, why doesn't God do that more often? Avoiding needless tragedy of people dying young or something. I also think it raises the problem of hiddenness, which is a deep worry for me, for example, for how Bill responds to the problem of evil. But anyways, probably haven't got time for that. Because if Jesus raised in a physical body with certain supernatural abilities, it seems to me Jesus could have revealed himself to millions, put the truth of Christianity beyond dispute. But so how do I answer these problems? And the core of it, Bill's already said, is to identify the resurrection and the ascension. So I'm rejecting this more familiar idea we find in Luke's Gospel and the Acts of the Apostles, that Jesus rises from the dead, hangs around for a bit, and then ascends to heaven. Rather, the moment of the resurrection on Easter morning is the moment Jesus returns to the Father, and Jesus is thereafter experienced in visions. A bit more like perhaps we think of Paul's experience on the road to Damascus. So what are we to imagine is that the first Easter morning, the followers of Jesus start being kind of thrown to the ground and having incredible, overwhelming visions, both individuals and groups. First Mary Magdalene, then Peter, then the 11, and so on, that are such unprecedented and overwhelming involuntary force that even though it's not a matter of seeing and touching a body, it's undeniable that something real and radically new is taking place here. And it's that, to me, that kick-charges Christianity.
I have a feeling you don't agree with that account of the resurrection.
No. It is the burden of N.T. Wright's massive book, The Resurrection of the Son of God, to show that the identification of the resurrection and the ascension is fundamentally misrepresenting the view of antiquity. Gary Habermas has characterized N.T. Wright's book playfully as an 800-page word study. What Wright shows is that the word resurrection, anastasis, never referred to the assumption of a person bodily into heaven. Whether it was among pagans who denied it or Jews who believed in it, the resurrection never referred to someone's being taken up into heaven out of this world. And so I think that Philip's view is simply at odds with the historical evidence.
Well, that's putting it quite plainly. And Philip, I suppose my question is that occurs to me is why do you want to try and sort of get the resurrection in your view? A lot of, what's kind of the motivation almost for you sort of trying to kind of factor the resurrection into this limited God view by making it a visionary experience for the disciples, an assumption into heaven and so on?
I mean, I don't think I had some pre-interest in, making sense of this or getting into Christianity. I mean, I suppose I find the kind of arguments Bill puts forwards and others and N.T. Wright about, there's something weird here that needs explaining. I find that compelling, and I do think that here is an adequate explanation of what happened. I mean, I also have found this Eastern Orthodox conception of Christianity very compelling at a spiritual level. So it's the package, I suppose. I've read N.T. Wright's book. Actually, the first time I talked about Christianity and a God of limited powers, just a quick anecdote here, in Oxford, and I had a beer on my own before the talk, and I bumped into N.T. Wright, and we had a chat about this. And then I walked to the talk and bumped into Alistair McGrath. It was, anyway,
there you go.
This cosmic purpose going on.
Those are the kinds of encounters you can have when you're wandering around Oxford, isn't it? But go ahead. I mean, what I really want to get down here is is the reason you want the resurrection the way that you've described it? Is it because you cannot have a resurrection in the manner Bill has described, the one that he believes is the plain reading of the way anastasis and all of the words, what they mean, because otherwise you would have a God who could raise people from the dead, and that just doesn't figure in your limited God sort of hypothesis.
No, it's not. Well, it's the reasons I said yes. It's to do with God's limitations, and I think God would be too powerful. It would get us back to the problem of evil. It would get us to the problem of hiddenness. Yes, that's the reason. So the traditional view has a very low prior probability for me, for people who know about that kind of stuff. But there is a question for me. Yes, if it was these visions, how did they get this idea of the resurrection? And my answer to this is that, again, we're building on this Eastern Orthodox idea that the death and resurrection of God transformed the relationship between God and humanity, brought them into this deep state of intimacy, and deepened the possible experiences of God that are available to us. Now, my hypothesis in this extended paper I've got is that Jesus prepped before the crucifixion, prepped his followers to recognize and deeply participate in this transformed relationship when it emerged, and to recognize that Jesus is physically alive at the core of it, to comprehend that, so that due to this, and we hear in the Gospels, Jesus does talk about the death and resurrection. People, they don't understand it, but anyway, he talks about it. So that with this preparation, at the moment there is this transformation in reality, it does lead to these deep profound visionary experiences, and to the disciples apprehending that this is that this is Jesus physically alive in the state we will be at the end of time. And this is the start of the resurrection when God sorts out the world. Look, if you read Paul on the resurrection, he, as N.T. Wright says, he sort of seems to be struggling to make sense of this. He's saying, he talks of, a seed and the wheat it grows into. There's continuity, but there's radical difference. There's different kinds of physicality. It's like this is physical, but a very different kind of physicality. N.T. Wright himself talks about trans-physicality. So I take myself to be in that ballpark. This is a physical resurrection, but radically different. Maybe I'm taking it to its logical extreme.
Bill, your response.
Jews of the first century were familiar with visionary experiences, and they had a different category for that. They would not describe that with the language of resurrection from the dead. And therefore, this view is simply un-Jewish and, I think, ruled out by the proper understanding of Jewish thought forms. Now, in our limited time remaining, I want to press one more objection against Philip's view. And that is, I think his core idea here is self-referentially incoherent. Here's what he says, and I'm quoting, "God's nature is just too different to ours for us and God to share a common unified form of existence. It is only when there is physicality within the inner being of God, as a result of the incarnate logos being taken up into God, that we physical creatures can participate in the divine life." End quote. In other words, God is so different from us physical creatures that unless the incarnate logos is taken up into God physically, then we could not be unified with God and participate in the divine life. This is self-referentially incoherent, for how could Christ's physical human nature be united with God if ours cannot? And therefore, it seems to me that the view is incoherent.
Philip?
Just briefly on this being inconsistent with the kind of N.T. Wright definition of what physicality means, I do find this very persuasive if we're talking about the more familiar opposition that it was purely spiritual resurrection. And when you talk about visions, that's normally what's meant. It was purely spiritual. I understand the point there, but that's not what I'm talking about. This was a physical resurrection, and in the state we will be as resurrected. So it seems to me it fits better. And this, I mean, you could think of it as this was the concept when Jesus was trying to prep his followers to understand this. He knew they understand this concept as the state will be in at the end of time, this physical continuity. He knew this would be the best concept to get them onto this. So this, I think, provides us as an adequate explanation of how the disciples got onto this idea of resurrection, because Jesus knew it was the best tool they had, the best concept they had to get onto this. Interesting objection to the incoherence. I'm not sure I totally got it right. The thought is that God has the power to become incarnate, to fuse an aspect of God's being, the Logos, with an aspect of physical reality, and then that thing can be, as it were, reabsorbed, now physical. So at that point, God takes on more of a physical nature through being unified with that physical nature. And then once God has a physical nature, us mere contingent, time-ridden, is that a word? Beings can then be involved in that. Time-bound, maybe that's a... Am I missing the objection? I'm not sure I got the objection, really.
Bill, come back and tell us what Philip's missing.
The idea is that we physical creatures cannot be absorbed into union with God and the divine life because he's spiritual and we're physical. And my point is that holds as well for the incarnate Jesus. He could not be absorbed into the divine life in his human nature if God is so different to physical beings that we cannot be absorbed. And therefore, it does no good to appeal to Jesus' absorption into God as a prelude for our participation in divine life, because the same thing that would prevent us from participating would prevent Christ in his human nature from participating.
Well, there's a big difference between you and I and Jesus, assuming that Jesus is God incarnate, is part of one being with God. And so the thought is, it's that facilitates this. I'm using the word reabsorption. I'm not sure I'm entirely happy with that word, but reunification. So it's that creates the potential for that reunification, which is not something each of us has to God. So God can't, in the first instance, absorb me into God's being that way. But once there is that precedent, then there is closeness. There's closeness to bring about that greater intimacy.
Well, look, I suspect we may have to draw a line just here at the differences, obviously, in your interpretation here. I mean, as I see it, Bill's key sort of difference here with you, though, Philip, is that he just doesn't think it's supported by what Scripture says, and the way in which the accounts are given to us. And so I think at various points, Bill has said it feels a bit ad hoc, the way that you reorder Christian theology and doctrine to kind of fit this sort of limited God
Can
model.
I just say there are a fair number of scholars who think the first Christians identified the resurrection Ascension. This isn't just something I've made up, by the way. Dale Allison.
That's a mistake, Philip. When you attribute such views to people like Wolfhard Pannenberg and Dale Allison, you've misinterpreted them. You don't understand them. It's true that many of these scholars interpret the resurrection appearances as objective visions, but they do not interpret the resurrection to be identical with Jesus' assumption into heaven.
Okay, I've got a quote here. I've got his book, Dale Allison's book, in front of me, page 224. He says, one often reads that, he's talking about the literature, for early Christians, Jesus' resurrection was his ascension. So the Easter witnesses must have seen him in heaven. And then he references 5 people, including Pannenberg, 5 people spanning almost a century. So that's a direct quote from Dale Allison. I appreciate, actually, I did slightly misspeak in my paper that Allison himself doesn't quite have that view. He has a very close view, but he doesn't. But he certainly does state there that it's a common view in the literature.
I have corresponded with him about that passage in preparation for this interview, and while he discusses these views, he does not endorse them.
Okay.
Yeah. I slightly misspoke. He's inclined to the view. I also emailed him. He's inclined to the view that there was a close chronological period between the resurrection and the ascension, closer than the normal view, and that the ascension happened before any resurrection experiences. So it's not quite the identity that the view I've been talking about, the same thing. But anyway, the important point is he certainly states it's a common view in the literature.
We might need Dale Allison himself to be explicit about where exactly he draws these lines. I mean, this has been such a fascinating conversation, and I'm so pleased to be able to brought you together. And I feel like Bill has certainly put you through your paces, Philip, in terms of your new hypothesis, and Philip has had plenty of questions for Bill as well about things like whether Molinism is a satisfactory way of dealing with the problem of suffering and evil. I suppose my overall question, perhaps firstly to you, Philip, is there a danger, in a sense, as a philosopher, of trying to kind of fit the God of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob into a sort of philosophical box where he works, basically, within your philosophical framework? And it's a question I had, actually, when I saw you in conversation with Alex O'Connor and Rowan Williams and Elizabeth Oldfield for the Panpsychism, where I felt that there was a sense in which you would come to a kind of philosophical way of managing God and coming to this sort of semi-heretical Christianity. And I just wondered, well, maybe God is bigger than the philosophical kind of box you arguably might be putting him in. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that, Philip?
Let me say 2 quick things. There's Christianity and all religions have always brought in new elements. The penal substitution view that Bill likes, that I don't like at all, as Bill says, was formulated by the Protestant reformers 500 years ago, although there was some precedent with Anselm 1,000 years before. It wasn't explicitly formulated from the start. it's very plausible, I think, that Greek philosophy informed the thinking about the Trinity and the creeds in the 3rd, 4th centuries. Aquinas had radically new philosophy. So this idea that, if you're doing philosophy, that's new or something. But look, secondly, in terms of the core of it, I'm not making up something new. I'm engaging with this Eastern Orthodox conception of Christianity that makes deep sense of my deepest spiritual experiences for me. It's God and the universe coming together through Jesus. It's a physical resurrection. Quick argument from authority. My colleague, the esteemed Catholic philosopher Karen Kilby, thinks my view of the resurrection is not heretical by Catholic standings because it's physical, and that's the important point. I agree with N.T. Wright that if it's purely spiritual, that's not Gnosticism. That's not good enough. I'm talking about physical reality being God and physical reality coming together. But the God of limited, the problem of evil, it doesn't make intellectual sense to me unless we can solve that with this God of limited powers. But once we solve that, I think of the intellectuals as sort of the gatekeeper. Then the gates open, and from then on, I think I've just got core Christian beliefs similar to the Eastern Orthodox Church. But I think there's no difference really to any other Eastern Orthodox belief. I'm an Anglican, by the way, but my spirituality is influenced by that. So then, in the core of it, I don't think I'm inventing some new thing.
I understand that, yes. But Bill, ultimately, what do you think we lose if people were to start adopting Philip's brand of Christianity? What would they essentially lose in the process?
I think it's very uncharitable to attribute these incoherencies and implausible views to our Eastern Orthodox brethren. I didn't say that.
I didn't quite say that. I didn't mean to say that. I didn't mean to say they have my view of limited God and stuff.
Okay. That's what I want to encourage Philip to do is to keep thinking about the concept of God, because I think that this is foundational for everything. And if he can come to the view of God as an unembodied mind, distinct from, separable from the world, the creator and designer of the universe, then I think everything else will fall into place.
Can I ask Bill a question? I'm just
Yes.
curious about. Do you think I'm a Christian?
Me? You're asking me?
I'm just curious.
As I said at the beginning of this podcast, I am not claiming that you are a heretic or unorthodox. My concern is that your views are wild speculations that are philosophically, scientifically, and historically untenable. And your relationship to God is for you and him to work out, certainly not for me to stand in and judge.
Thank you.
Well, that's a helpful place maybe to leave it. Thank you very much both for a fascinating conversation. It has obviously been highly philosophical but very engaging. Perhaps, in due course, there might be a more sort of spiritually sort of experiential one. We didn't get onto questions about what it means to you to pray and that kind of thing, Philip, but maybe we could do that another time, because that's a sort of the next level, if you like. But for now, thank you both for being my guests on this really interesting conversation. If you want more from either Bill or Philip, you can find both their websites, philipgoffphilosophy.com and reasonablefaith.org for Bill. For now, thank you both for being my guest today.
Certainly.
Thank you very much. It's been fun.
Well, we're coming back for a little after-show debrief and a conversation. I'm joined by Peter Byrom, who is someone I work very closely with at Think Faith. He's the operations manager. We've been friends for many years. And it's probably worth reminding viewers and listeners that you have your own surprising rebirth story that connects, interestingly, with Bill Craig, one of the guests today. Do you want to just quickly remind us of that story, Peter?
That's right. And to shamelessly plug season 1 of the Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God podcast, you can catch my story in episodes 1, 3, and 19.
There you go.
Yeah. So no, my rebirth story to give you the quick version, really is it was one of losing faith and being very much persuaded of the kind of new atheism of the likes of Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens when I was at university. This is around sort of 2005 to 2009. I found the new atheists very persuasive, but then discovered people like William Lane Craig, who we've just been watching, having his dialogue with Philip Goff, and other Christian apologists I discovered, and that really kind of tipped me. I bought Dawkins' line about you need evidence for your beliefs, otherwise it's just, blind faith. And so I thought, all right, give me your evidence, Christians. And then Bill Craig comes along and, there's quite a lot there, and that was very much instrumental in turning me around, going, oh, hang on a minute. I've made this big demand for evidence for Christian faith, for the truth of Christian faith, and it looks like they've got some pretty strong evidence for it. And that was a huge part in my own conversion. But as of course were you, Justin, because of course at the time, you were interviewing apologists, you were hosting debates. So I just devoured the stuff, and all of that played a big role in bringing me to become a Christian.
Yeah, and I remember well the 2011 UK tour with William Lane Craig that you were very helpful in helping to organise, and some video material around it. And I know that was sort of a point at which you came to a decision actually that you couldn't sustain your atheism any longer, and you sort of gave in to Christian faith at that point.
Yeah. I became rather troublesome for Richard Dawkins. I stood up in a Q&A at one of his debates and basically asked him straight to his face, so what's the deal with you not debating William Lane Craig? Is this an example of the new atheists running away from the stronger challengers? And yeah, I was involved in helping to promote William Lane Craig's Reasonable Faith UK tour in 2011, which included helping to mock up and design that spin of the British Humanist Association bus posters. Instead of saying there's probably no God, now stop worrying and enjoy your life, we flipped it to say there's probably no Dawkins. That is, there's probably no Dawkins showing up to debate Craig. So stop worrying, enjoy October 25th at the Sheldonian Theatre. And yeah, so that was we'll probably come to this, but it was a different era. It was
Yes.
it was a very hardcore kind of debatey era.
Yes.
That's where my beliefs were forged, if that's the right word.
Yeah. And I brought you on for us to have this sort of reflection on the discussion that we've just had between Bill Craig and Philip Goff. I have to say, it was real fun, first of all. It's many people may know me from the years I spent hosting these kinds of dialogues week in and week out on Unbelievable. This was the first really proper one I've come back to, and it's pretty much 2 years actually since moving on from that show. And it was great fun to have both Philip and Bill going at it, with such philosophical rigor. And there's always something fun about being in the middle of that. But like you, it kind of brought me back in a sense to that big set piece debate thing, and that more kind of, if you will, left-brained way of approaching the world, which is all about, getting very strict concepts dialed down, debating them, and so on, which I think there's an important place for, obviously, but obviously not the way that most people tend to, on a day-to-day basis, engage faith. It was interesting, only right at the end, when Philip asked Bill, well, do you think I'm a Christian? That Bill was very happy to say, well, we've been going back and forth on the philosophical issues here, but I'm in no position to judge where you are spiritually with God. That's between you and God. And I thought that was a helpful kind of way of just at the very end making clear we've had a particular type of conversation here. It's not so much a sort of conversation about sort of the spiritual dimension of faith. It was this very rigorous, analytical, philosophical, sort of theological conversation at that level. But I think there's a place for that, and I think it was very helpful. What I appreciated was I've seen Philip talking about this new mode of sort of engaging Christian faith, this sort of semi-heretical level, as he likes to call it in a tongue-in-cheek way. I've never really seen anyone really kind of test what that would look like at a philosophical level. And I think Bill did a very good job of kind of, as I say, putting him through his paces on this one. Inevitably, it's the kind of thing, though, that will ultimately appeal to people who are looking for that kind of rigorous philosophical testing of ideas. But yeah, what were your thoughts about the conversation?
Yeah, well, I think you're right. I mean, what we have watched is what happens when two professional philosophers decide to go, right, let's do this. Let's really go for it and examine our ideas. Let's challenge them. Let's stress test them. In the way that any other profession would. Let's do what we're paid to do, which is to rigorously analyze thoughts and arguments. Now, I mean, I'm not ruling out the possibility that either of them might have felt frustrated, though, at some point. Like, that could very well have, I wondered at one point, is that happening? Are they rubbing each other a bit the wrong way here or not? Maybe they were fine. Maybe they're just being very, very rigorous and intense in the way that you could play an intense round of some kind of sport or something and just like, go on, let's nail this thing. And then at the end you shake hands and go, oh, good one, let's go down to the pub or something. So no, I think, those two definitely. Philip Goff is on a journey, to use that. It's a phrase that's used a lot, but he's used it himself. And yet he's very open about that. He was in one place and now he's sort of traveling along, and he was very clear about, I'm not pinning things down in an absolute way. This just seems to be the way things look at the moment. And so from one philosopher to another, they just went for it and started scrutinizing the ideas from a philosophical angle. Now, the interesting thing, I think maybe 10 years ago, I probably would have thought that's all you need to do. That's all that this is about. You need to hash out the rational arguments. But, again, more recently, I do think, and again, this is where, we've talked about Ian McGilchrist before, and the impact that his explanations of the brain hemispheres are just huge. And the idea that you cannot make everything about what the left hemisphere does, which is the left hemisphere breaks things down into these computational, abstract, static, analytical tasks. There comes a point where you've got to bring it back to the right hemisphere, which deals in much more kind of nuance, much more holistic, intuitive, even imaginative thought. And they've got to be working together. I think it's probably fair to say that we've witnessed a fairly left hemispheric conversation, right? I'd just be interested in your, for you being the moderator in the middle of that, watching that happen. I'd be interested in what it felt like for you and what you were thinking, because you can look at that in different ways. You can look at it as, well, so-and-so is making better arguments, bash out premise 1, premise 2 or whatever. But equally, there are other dynamics going on, how well is one person listening to the other or whatever. Yes. I don't know, just in any order, really. What was it like to be moderating that? What are your immediate reflections from having just come out of that?
My immediate reflections, as I say, is that it's a rigorous philosophical discussion, and there's a place for that. But inevitably, I think for many people, it will feel slightly like it's disconnected from the reality, arguably, of faith and belief and the things that actually bring people to God. And so it's interesting because, bringing this kind of quite philosophical conversation into the Surprising Rebirth, A Belief in God podcast series, it will strike, I'm sure, quite differently to many of the other kind of conversations we've had, which haven't by any means excluded philosophy and logic and analytics and so on, but have tended to weave it into a story that is also driven by personal, emotional, psychological reasons why people ultimately are finding faith in God. And sometimes when you do a debate that sort of almost exclusively sort of says we're just going to debate the kind of the philosophical grounds for this, it can sometimes obviously feel a bit abstract. As I said, that was the conversation we were inviting Philip and Bill to, and so it's absolutely right that they kind of went to and fro on those specific issues. I suppose for me though, what I might have wanted to do, had we had a little bit more time, would have been to tease out a little bit more, and we just touched on it right at the end, of Philip's personal spiritual journey. It would be fascinating, wouldn't it, to find out, well, what does he experience when he prays? Why does he go to church? Because in the end, that's sort of where the rubber hits the road. You can have, a well thought out philosophical conception of God. The question is, well, what difference does it make to your life in the end? That's where most people, I think, land on these questions. They're asking, well, what difference does it make? And I think having the right conception of God is important. It's important to know sort of what we're talking about when we talk about God. But in my experience, and probably the experience of most Christians, they're not thinking about disembodied immaterial minds and they're thinking about Jesus Christ, and that's for me is at the center of Christianity. Obviously, is that to help people understand who God is. God came in person, and likewise that was something that struck me again in the important discussion that was had about the problem of suffering and how does Philip square it. Well, he says, I've got to believe in a God of limited power. Bill has this particular Molinist view where he thinks that ultimately we don't have good cause to dismiss God on the basis that he could have adequate reasons for allowing a certain level of suffering in the world. All of that I accept, and I've used those arguments myself. But in the end, where I normally end up pointing people to in this kind of conversation is again Jesus. And because in a sense, it's only from within Christianity that you truly get, for me, not just a logical answer, but actually a sort of an answer that speaks to our spirit and our soul. And that is that Jesus, God incarnate, experienced suffering on our behalf. And that in some mysterious way, that in itself is actually a greater answer to the problem of suffering than any sort of philosophical theodicy. So these were the kinds of things going through my mind as I went, enjoying the conversation, thrilled to have both of them on board, but also thinking there are probably other ways you could open up these topics, as it were, from within a more experiential, spiritual kind of atmosphere rather than the philosophical one.
So it sounds like while you valued the rigor and the precision and the thoroughness of how Bill Craig and Philip Goff were challenging each other's ideas and testing them out and bringing out more detail about them, ultimately, that's not going to be the main propulsive force that kind of drives and sustains and maybe even attracts people to Christian faith, and not what keeps them going.
Yeah, as I say, I think for some people they do need that. I think to some extent at that point in your journey that you talked about, you needed something like that. You needed the evidence. That was kind of just where you were. And I think in a way it was God's grace that he gave you that. He gave you sufficient. But I doubt that would have been enough to sustain you in an ongoing basis. That you inevitably need more than that. And I think some people just don't even start at that sort of very philosophical level. They kind of want to jump straight in. I think the other thing that I found helpful about the conversation was that Philip, I think, was willing to say, look, I'm on, as you say, he said he was on a journey in the sense that he was willing to sort of say, look, let's not get too hung up on the specific version of God that I have defended here and there. And he quite rightly said, you've done your homework, Bill, at one point. And Bill always is, absolutely, we know this about Bill. He prepares meticulously for discussions and debates. And that's one of that's why, people like Sam Harris, in the heyday of the New Atheist, described him as the one Christian thinker that puts the fear of God into my fellow atheists. But at the same time, I think what Philip wanted to do was to say, well, look, don't limit me in a sense to the thing I've written in that book or that article. I'm kind of still working this out. And actually, I think what I sense Philip was saying was that, yes, I have defended this kind of panpsychism, this panentheism, but actually I'm very attracted to Christianity at a more gut level. He talks about this resonating with him, this idea that God has kind of drawn close to us through this sense that we can share in God's divine nature, and that is somehow uniquely happened in the person of Jesus Christ. And whereas Bill understandably might say, well, look, let's test that and see whether we can, put that through the philosophical ringer and it comes out. I might be more inclined to say, well, look, and I hinted at this, I'm glad that Philip's kind of on that journey, and I don't want to pour cold water on that, even as much as I'm going to say I don't personally think you've kind of arrived necessarily at the destination. There was actually a little I've been reading recently Letters of C.S. Lewis, which is a wonderful volume of his correspondence with lots of different people throughout the whole of his life, including his pre-Christian years and up to the point of his death. But there was one particular quote in a letter to a friend that I sort of had on hand and didn't manage to use, but it kind of for me encapsulated to some extent the way I feel about Philip's journey. And this is what Lewis wrote in this letter. He said, "I dare say that for some people at some moments, what I call semi-Christianity may be useful. After all, the road into the city and the road out of it are usually the same road. It depends on which direction one travels in." And that's my sense. I sense Philip is traveling in the right direction, if that makes sense, even if he's not arrived. Yeah. Go ahead.
I'm just getting a bit of a cheesy analogy coming to mind. I mean, in a way, it's a little bit like, and again, I'm thinking again of the kind of the McGilchrist model here of, how much time do you spend in what you call the right hemispheric forms of attention, whereby it's much more about receiving an immediate sense of an experience and a holistic understanding compared to let's break something down and analyze it in a more cold kind of way. And it's almost a little bit like if you've got a car, you want to go in the car to be on a journey. You want to drive the thing. You want the experience of driving it. You want to look out the window. You want to get to your destination. Every now and then, you need to open the bonnet and go in there and check the mechanics of what's going on. Do I need to refill the oil or whatever? Is something broken? Does something need tweaking? And it seems to me that the kind of left hemispheric or the very uber analytical philosophical mode is probably a bit like there are key moments where you've just got to open up the bonnet. You do have to go in there. You've got to analyze some detail. You've got to maybe fix something or adjust something. But it's not about living life with a car sat there with the bonnet open, just trying to tweak the engine. You've got to shut that bonnet, get back in the car, and get on that road. And it almost occurs to me, it almost seems a little bit like if Bill Craig is listening to this, I've no idea what he'll make of this analogy, but it's almost a little bit like this was one particular pit stop in Philip's journey. If he's driving down this road, it's a little bit like he's pulled into a lay-by and Bill has kind of come along, opened up the bonnet and kind of gone, I think you got some problems with this engine, but then, he's free to put the bonnet down, or maybe disagree, maybe the analogy breaks down a bit because, maybe it's two mechanics who are fighting. I don't know. But then he's free to, get back in the car, get back on the journey. And yeah, as you say, see where the journey goes.
Yeah, absolutely. I like that analogy. I think that's quite helpful. And I wish him very well as he continues in that journey. As I say, philosophical debates are great fun and important in various ways. Perhaps my overriding hope is however, that Philip does, arrive at a truly Christ-centered view of God, and yeah, I wish him well on the journey. I'm sure we'll check in with him again at some point in due course. But yeah, great fun to just sort of catch up with some thoughts post discussion with you, Peter. And yeah, any final thoughts?
Well, here's something where I'm going to probably sound very impertinent, because I should say, I'm not primarily what you might call a left hemispheric or an analytical person. I'm a very kind of my university degree was drama and theatre. I'm an arts guy, but interestingly enough, my Christian journey switched on when I was introduced to people like Bill Craig, and the analytical part of me started switching on. It's kind of like my left hemispheric forms of attention came and joined the party. So I didn't give up the creative stuff. I just added some analytical rigor here. So I owe Bill a lot for that. But one bit where I'm inclined, I might be disagreeing with Bill. I don't know, or it might not be quite that much. I would weight. I think I weight things a little differently. I agree with Bill Craig when he says, you do need to spend some good time thinking of your concept of God. And of course, I agree with Bill. I share the belief that, it makes sense to say that God is an unembodied mind. The key thing about Christian theism is the idea that mind came first. The divine mind came first and decided, I'm going to create a physical universe. And then there you go, you get the physical universe. And I do think that's important. I've said before, I've said it, you've interviewed me about it in the first season of Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, where I've given my view of how, the reason why Richard Dawkins' main argument against God is such an appalling failure is because he completely fails to grapple with God as an unembodied mind. He tries to treat God as if he's some kind of gigantic creature made out of parts, but of course an unembodied mind doesn't have parts. So it is important that you do, your concept of God does matter. And there is a difference between that kind of grand unembodied mind and one which is kind of like a sort of consciousness suffused with the universe. Here's where I would disagree, I think, with Bill Craig. I really get the impression, I'm inclined to take Philip Goff at face value, where he says that the biggest issue for him is the problem of evil and suffering. Because when you read his work, when you listen to him, he really does make it front and center. Everything is built around how do you make sense of the problem of evil and suffering, to the extent that it sounds like even the nature of Jesus' resurrection is kind of restricted because it has to fit this limited God hypothesis. And I do think it would be interesting to watch on Philip's journey where he goes with that question of the problem of evil and suffering. I mean, we got a little bit into Bill Craig's Molinistic model, but the typical thing that people like William Lane Craig and others as well will argue, again from a strictly philosophical point of view. Pastorally, I don't know how much use this has, but in thinking of it academically, there is that whole thing about, well, you're putting a very heavy burden on yourself, a huge epistemic burden. If you're going to hold to the problem of evil, you need to show that God couldn't have good reasons for allowing the evil and suffering, even on a probabilistic weighing it up. You would need to give some kind of, again, I'm going to sound like Bill Craig, shoulder the burden of proof for how you can show that it's so unlikely. You need to give a case for that. In the event that we went to, I think the Panpsychism, that event where it was Philip Goff and Alex O'Connor, Rowan Williams and Elizabeth Oldfield, Philip said, it looks like God's existence is less than 1% likely, given the existence of the problem of evil. That is, the all-powerful God is less than 1% likely.
And I honestly believe that the suffering we find, the rational conclusion to draw is that an all-powerful, loving creator is incredibly unlikely. I mean, almost not impossible, but less than 1%.
And I do think that's quite a weighty burden for Philip to shoulder. But I suspect that the problem of evil is the big thing for Philip. And I suspect that his panpsychist views, his panentheistic views, I'd be willing to give him the benefit of the doubt and think that if he found a more satisfying way of looking at the problem of evil and suffering with the standard idea of, the maximally great, all-powerful God, if he found a more satisfying way of just viewing that, then maybe then he might go further down that journey to what you might call the standard unembodied mind or whatever. So I would be inclined to weight the problem of evil more than have you got your definition of God's ontology correct, you know. But I like what you were saying though about how actually, again, for the Christian it's about Jesus, isn't it? It's about
I'd say so. And I suppose, again, you know, just to reiterate that point, I think you're right. If a satisfactory theodicy was presented to Philip Goff that allowed for the existence of an all-powerful God and reconciled the problem of evil and suffering, that would be good. He'd have kind of solved the philosophical problem. I just think that's still a slightly different question as to how we kind of understand God's relationship to suffering, when clearly in Christianity and through Scripture it's mediated in the person of Jesus Christ. That's kind of the central way in which God speaks to the problem of suffering. And for me, I think you have to go there at some point. And perhaps that might be the basis for another conversation with Philip, because, as I say, his what he's written and what he spoke about on the show today was far more related to this idea of Christ's resurrection and whether it's the same thing as the Ascension and so on. What I haven't really seen him say much about is what does happen in the cross and how that speaks to the question of suffering. And that might be one to pick up with him at some point, because I'm sure Philip has himself experienced a certain measure of suffering and evil in the world. And for me, I don't claim to have come to some perfect way of reconciling it myself. All I know is that if there is an answer, Jesus has to be in the middle of it, and that's I suppose the kind of tension that a lot of Christians end up living in.
Yeah, you've just reminded me of one last greedy question, actually.
Go ahead.
that I want to sneak in here, because as you were saying, if it's about being on the journey and it is about the Christian understanding, with Jesus right at the middle of it, I was really interested. He kept coming back to this attraction to the Eastern Orthodox way of understanding God, understanding Jesus, of being a Christian, of the mystical practices. And I think, again, in the event that we saw, the Panpsychism event, I think it was Elizabeth Oldfield who basically said, Philip, what I really appreciate about you is that you're not just doing the rigorous academic diligence here as a philosopher. You are going to church. You're actually you're attending this thing. You're ritualizing it. You're not just standing outside the church going, well, I have to make all the premises add up before I even bother to step in and try this thing out. I was just curious about what you make of that, because in what you've been covering about the surprising rebirth, I've noticed you've been saying a lot of people have been, and it's a Tom Holland thing, keep Christianity weird. And you get Paul Kingsnorth sort of saying that, the church has made this kind of ugly, rationalistic pact with modernity and that kind of thing. What did you make of the way that the kind of the Eastern Orthodox and the mystical, ritualistic practices kept coming back? They never got a lot in the foreground because it's these two philosophers hashing it out, but they're there. What do you make of that?
Yeah, I think that's right, and it makes sense to me that Philip Goff is attracted to that Eastern Orthodox way of thinking about God, which is, and I think his primary reason is that the Eastern Orthodox do in general take a different view of salvation and Christ's sort of atoning death, whereas Protestant theology has gone off in this more penal atonement sort of direction. That's, as I understand it, that's not the way that most Eastern Orthodox think about what happens on the cross. And so I think, again, for those kinds of reasons, he finds himself more attracted to the Eastern Orthodox way of thinking about that. But also I can imagine that more sort of mystical approach to God, which is actually quite, I think, sympathetic towards panentheism. I remember when I had a conversation with Ian McGilchrist, he also said, along the same lines. I probably think of myself as a panentheist when it comes to God, which is not at all, irreconcilable with the Eastern Orthodox tradition. So I think all of those things obviously lead Philip Goff in that direction. When I see people entering the Eastern Orthodox churches, and it frequently is because it speaks to a more mystical dimension of people's lives. It's not about sort of a half an hour sermon that sort of just is about getting to the bottom of a particular Bible verse or whatever. It's the whole process of entering into this mystical experience of God through the liturgy and the icons and all of the things that go into an Eastern Orthodox service. So I think he's probably somewhere on that kind of journey as well, and I'm glad of that in the sense that, as I say, I'd never want someone to sort of, as you said, decide not to go into church because they haven't worked out how to put all the pieces of the puzzle together. I think we very often do that in the process of going on the journey. Who was it? One of the church fathers or early Christians who said, "I believe in order to understand." There's a sense which you have to enter this, and then things perhaps start to make sense from the inside rather than poking around from the outside until you're satisfied you can enter. So I can imagine Philip is having an important journey. Perhaps again he'll return to tell us about that. But I certainly meet lots of other people in a similar situation to him. Many of the people we interviewed on the first season, Louise Perry, Tom Holland, and others, all talked about this fact that, hey, I'm turning up at church even though my disenchanted brain is struggling to kind of get my head around it. I feel it's important to be here, and that in itself, I think, is quite interesting.
Watch this space, eh?
Indeed. Thanks for the conversation. Thanks for having a little chance to debrief and decompress after that really high energy discussion between Philip and Bill. We'll make sure there are links, of course, to both of our guests with today's show and to some of the other things that we've mentioned along the way. For now, Peter, thanks for being with me.
Thank you, Justin, and well hosted.
Thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed the conversation. Would you like a free chapter of my book, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God? Well, subscribe to my newsletter at the link in the info, and it's yours. And remember, if you'd like exclusive access to my full interview with Philip Goff to fill you in on more of his journey, then just become a supporter. Silver supporters get early access episodes and bonus content. Gold supporters also get signed books and invites to monthly catch-ups with me. The support links are with the info. See you next time.